Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 18 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That is Gavin. Gavin, I believe some congratulations are in order.
Oh, why, thank you.
So, for everybody, Gavin is far too modest to bring it up on his own. So, I'm going to bring it up a mere 20 seconds into this podcast, or however deep we are. But Gavin, we talked about your master's thesis a couple episodes ago, and I believe
We
you had
sure
to
did.
defend that last week. How'd that go?
Well, I passed. So I am, even though I am not quite graduated yet, I just have, regular classwork for a couple of classes that I'm taking left to do. And then my committee basically gave me some edits to make that I just have to, change around a couple things, add a couple things into my thesis, and then send it back to them for their approval. And then I am a master of science.
Congratulations, buddy. That is that's exciting, and that's a lot of hard work that you put in. We've talked about it a whole bunch on the show. So that is, you should definitely be proud of yourself for everything you've been able to do.
Why, thank you. And it actually kind of is convenient for this episode's topic.
Absolutely.
But before we get into all of that good stuff, a couple announcements before we get into it, before we even get into the This Week in Science. First, a big thank you to the Instagram account Cactus Qual Creations for shouting us out sort of on their Instagram story. It's a wildlife type Instagram account. I don't Instagram, so I don't know, but they posted something about us on their story, and if anybody came to us from seeing that on the story, thank you.
And we'll make sure that we link to them down in our podcast description. What was the name of the Instagram account one more time?
Cactus Qual, so the word cactus, Quoll creations.
Cactus Qual Creations. Perfect. So we will make sure we link them. Thank you very much for giving us that shout out. And if there's anybody else out there that wants to shout us out, please, you do not need our permission. My name is Mike. That is Gavin. Just tell people to listen to the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Some
And
other real
go
quick
ahead.
announcements. As sometimes we forget to mention it until the end, like bad hosts. But if you would like to submit a topic for us to talk about on the episode, or if you would like to come on as a guest, if you happen to be a interesting person in the realms of biology or geology, we'd love to have you on. So feel free to fill out those forms down in the show notes as well.
Yeah, we are definitely looking to do kind of new and interesting things with the podcast, and so that includes branching out and maybe expanding this into a three-way podcast every now and again. So having some special guests on. So if you are out there, if you've got something you want us to cover, or if you know what you're talking about, it'd be nice to have a second person on this podcast that maybe knows what they're talking about. Um, so yeah, all of that will be down in the show notes. And this has been, I've got to say, if we're talking about announcements and everything and ways to grow the podcast, this has been a lot of fun. This is definitely, I knew this was going to be a fun thing to do, just knowing how much I enjoy talking with you,
Mhm.
but just the amount I've learned and just the opportunity to talk to you once a week. This has definitely been a fun podcast. So if you're looking to join on, it's a good time. You won't regret it.
Yeah, absolutely. We love talking to new interesting people.
Absolutely. So do we have any other announcements, or are we ready for this week in science?
I don't think so. So let's talk about this one. So, if you had to guess, this one I will say, considering that they're usually relatively recent, this one's actually relatively old compared to the ones that we usually talk about. So, if you had to guess, what year? What year would you guess?
Relatively old compared to what we normally do. So I'm going to say
Not super
2014.
old, but older.
I'm saying 2014.
Swing and a miss.
Oh my gosh. How old?
2005.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
this is.
That
I
is
think this is the oldest one we've
way
talked
older.
about.
This is the oldest one by I think at least a decade.
Probably pretty close. Yeah.
Yeah. What do we got?
But so the headline is from actually today. It's not often that we get some from a Wednesday, but Wednesday, April 14th, 2005. And the headline is New Layer of Earth Detected, which is why I picked it, because I don't remember hearing this, but also at the time I was 9. So so let's see. So it goes, Dr. Christine Thomas, a geophysicist from the University of Liverpool in the UK, announced that she had discovered a previously undetected seismic layer resting very near the Earth's core, nearly 2,900 kilometers, or roughly 1,800 miles in American. I know it's not actually American units, but it's just fun to say because we're Americans suck and don't use the metric system. Anyway, below the Earth's surface. This discovery, which was achieved through the use of modern modeling technologies, measured the flow of seismic waves as they traveled through the Earth and enabled the measurement of the mantle's internal temperature at a much deeper level than previously possible. Experts say that the discovery will undoubtedly allow future temperature measurements of the Earth's core to be undertaken with much more precision, information that is vital for any member of Earth-based sciences.
So wait, you said they discovered a new layer, and then you read that and it
Yes.
sounded like they were just measuring the temperature of the mantle a lot more closely. So what's the,
So
yeah, help me out
I
here.
had always learned that there are four main layers to the Earth's, to the Earth.
That's
There's the
the,
crust,
that's the die. Yeah.
right? There's the crust, which if it's often compared to like an apple. So if you think of like
Right.
the crust is like the skin of an apple, relative to like the actual thickness of the Earth, extremely thin. Then you have the mantle, which is the best word, the most accurate word used to describe it is plastic. It is not, meaning that it is not liquid, but it is very elastic and flexible and flows.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you get to things at this large of a scale, solid, there's much blurrier of a line between like solid and liquid.
Right.
So even though it is solid rock, it flows, similar to a very, very viscous liquid, like a cold syrup, almost. Um, but yeah, so there's the crust, the mantle, then there's the outer core, which is liquid. That is actually liquid, and then there is the inner core, which is solid, because
All the
while it
pressure,
is
right?
hotter than the outer core, it is under so much pressure that the pressure does not let the atoms move into an arrangement that is liquid.
Okay, so we've got those main four layers, and then what
Mhm.
was discovered in this?
It seems like there might be some kind of thin layer sort of in between the mantle and the outer core.
Huh, okay.
Well, and so obviously we've never drilled that far or even close. Um,
Yet.
it is physically impossible.
So far.
I if we're able to even make it into the mantle in my lifetime, I will be astounded. Not because it's all that far down, but just the pressure and heat like melts the equipment that we use,
Right.
even at
Right, it
like the
won't be
top of the
easy.
mantle.
Yeah, it won't be easy.
Yeah. Um, but the reason that we know this is the case um, is that mostly through just our understanding of physics, realistically, because uh, we know that the outer core is liquid because there are two different kinds of waves, like energy waves produced by earthquakes. They're called S waves and P waves.
Mm-hmm.
And I should know this, but I can't think of which one's which. I think the S waves cannot go through liquid, and so it's like we don't get readings of the earthquake directly on the opposite side of the world from where the earthquake happened. So the liquid acts as like a block to those S waves. So that's sort of how we know that at least some part of the middle of the earth is liquid. Then we know the mantle is sort of plastic and not really liquid because uh, they travel, the P waves and S waves sort of travel differently. And so because of that, there is, uh, they react differently to different densities throughout the Earth's core and the inside of the Earth. So because of that, we sort of theoretically know that uh, the mantle is plastic.
Yeah, I mean, so I I don't know. The fact that we still can tell what's going on underneath all these layers is still mind blowing to me. Like everybody always talks about space, and for the record,
Yep.
space, absolutely awesome. But
Hmm.
like the stuff that happens on Earth that you know, we can only indirectly observe in some ways is also just like fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, so okay, because it is all theoretical. Um, I actually saw a TikTok about it. No, and okay, to be fair, I don't have a TikTok. I saw somebody share a TikTok on Twitter, uh, but somebody uh, basically being like, "Well, we've never been there, so like, how do we know that the Earth's not like hollow?" And I was like, please read. Um, and it's like I don't think it's necessarily that person's fault for being misinformed. Um, but like if you're going to be confident enough to say things like that on your social media, please read a little bit beforehand. Um,
Yeah, that'd be nice. This reminds me of when I have every now and again I'll have a student that'll be like, "So how do we actually know like the past happened?" And I'm like, "Oh well, I've got to have this conversation now."
yeah, it's like, well, how? Well, and that gets real weird. Like U.S. history is pretty straightforward. It gets real weird around stuff like the Peloponnesian War, because like the only evidence that we really have of that like is pretty much like Greek myths and stuff.
Right, or even weirder with like the Trojan War, where everybody thought that it was fake, and now there are some people that are like, maybe it's not fake. Like it's
Yeah.
right, like it definitely gets into those hairy areas.
Hmm.
I also have had students. In fact, I had a former student just this week send me an email saying hi, saying blah blah blah, and then also sending me photographic evidence that the Earth is not round nor flat, but in fact dinosaur shaped.
Ah, cool.
Um, yeah, so this is the kind of thing that we're all dealing with.
See, one of my favorite things to do with that kind of like obviously they were memeing,
Oh, of course.
but so people who legitimately think the Earth is flat. Um, I don't remember what it's called, but quick side tangent. There's an excellent
Behind the curve.
on a documentary on Netflix. Is that what we talked about?
That's the one.
Okay, yes, it's excellent. If you've not seen it, please go watch it. It is so good. Um, it basically follows a group of flat earthers, and like to my knowledge, the people being documented don't know that like the documentarian is not a flat earther, because like
I mean,
it
I
kind of
mean
just
they.
seems like they're following them around to just document how silly they are, but they
I
talk
mean,
to the camera as if like very very freely.
yeah. I mean they. One of the questions I always had was, are these just really elaborate trolls, or do they actually believe what they're saying? Right. I think a lot of them believe what
Those
they're
people
saying.
believe. Those people
Yep.
absolutely believe. At least those people in the documentary. But anyway, side tangent aside.
Yes.
Um, so I always like to come at like conspiracy theorists with an even crazier one, where it's like when people come at me with like the Earth's flat, and I'm like, nah, the Earth's a cylinder. The part that you think is flat, that's just the top. Where's the rest of us? Or where's the rest of it? What aren't they telling us? And it's like the "what aren't they telling us" line is the one that really gets them. Um,
Hmm.
and then also people who don't believe in like the moon landing. I'm like, you believe in the moon? And then
Oh
they're
yeah.
just, I mean, typically it's people who if they don't believe in the moon landing, I'd say there's a not insignificant chance that they're also a flat earther who don't believe in the moon. So it's like those lines get a little blurred, but anyway, moral of the story: please troll conspiracy theorists. It's very fun.
It can, as long as it's done safely, it can be a
Yes.
good time. On occasion, things get a little hairy.
Yeah.
Anyways, we should probably get to the actual topic of what it is that we're talking about today, which we alluded to it earlier, but we actually don't have a written out script for this one, and it's
Nope.
sort
This
of
is
in it's kind of an honor or in celebration of Gavin being able to successfully defend his thesis, and so kind of the whole point of today's episode is we were just going to talk about um, mostly Gavin's, but this is one of the few episodes I have something to contribute. We're going to kind of talk about our experience in grad school, which I think will be a really fun opportunity for the both of us to just talk about our experiences and possibly give some advice to anybody that's listening.
Yeah, absolutely. This is very much more of like a talking head type video. And also, Mike, don't sell yourself short. You always have something to contribute. You're great.
I appreciate you humoring me with whatever innuendo I bring to our podcast.
um, but yeah, I just wanted to go through sort of the entire grad school process, sort of just from beginning to end. Uh, for anyone who, maybe you're not in grad school yet, or maybe you're in your first couple of years of, your undergraduate degree, and you are just want maybe extra opinions about how grad school works, or maybe you've already done your bachelor's and are thinking about going back. That's also very common as well. Uh, but yeah, just talking about grad school from beginning to end, at least for a master's degree.
Which is all you or I have. So we can't speak
Yes,
to anything beyond that, at least not personally.
right. And so, obviously, like I mentioned at the beginning, I will have a Master of Science degree, so an MS degree in paleontology. Um, and there's all sorts of different degrees. There's Master of Engineering, Master of Arts. So yours is an MA, right?
It was kind of an odd. It was MST was the it was Master
Okay,
of Science in Teaching was I believe the
interesting.
official, yeah, which I never got too deep into any of the
Right, yeah.
acronyms, but yeah, that's what my master's degree is in.
Cool. So I guess let's just sort of start at the beginning. So for me, and I know this is definitely different for teaching than it is for me, but for broadly in the sciences, you apply to grad school less for the actual school. Like that absolutely does play a factor, but you apply mostly to be working with a particular person. Um, that's less true for a master's than it is for a PhD. Um, but before I even applied to any of the schools that I applied to, I ended up applying to four schools for a master's. Um, I sent emails to the people that I would be working with, basically being like, "Hey, I think the research that you do is really interesting. Um, do you have an open space, in your lab? Basically, are you taking students for this upcoming year?" And then based on their responses, I would apply. Basically, have a quick chat. Whether it's I think it was exclusively through email, um, but that again just varies wildly depending on the person that you're trying to work with. Some of them will really insist on uh, having like some kind of phone call or something, or for a PhD program that might even fly you out to wherever the school is to have like a tour of their facilities or something. Um, but yeah, so you send them an email, sort of just chat with them, and then once they sort of give you their blessing that yes, I will take you in my lab if you get into the school, then you apply to the school and fill out all the normal application type things.
So it sounds like with kind of with your program in the sciences, you're applying to be with people more than anything else, and the actual institution is I don't want to say it's not important, but it's definitely secondary to the people you're going to be working with and working
Hmm.
under.
Yeah, definitely. So the four schools that I applied to were obviously the one that I go to now, the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. I applied to Cal State Fresno in obviously Fresno, California. Um, I applied to Fort Hays State University in Hays, Kansas, and to University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And so I got into all of them except for University of Michigan, who I never heard back from. Like not even like a hey, you didn't get in. I just literally heard nothing. So that made me sad.
As it should.
Like if I didn't get in, at least tell me.
Right, exactly. Same thing with like job interviews. Like I would like to know to
Yeah,
not be sitting by the phone.
yeah, absolutely. And uh, so the big difference, I think, for me, well, actually, what before I talk about where, like, why I decided to come here instead of the other two that I got into, what was the application process like for you as a teacher?
Yeah, a little different from me. I don't believe I've told this story before, and I will leave out some of the more funny bits. But I
Sure.
graduated with a political science degree,
Hmm.
from Syracuse University, and I did not know I wanted to be a teacher. You know, a lot of the people you talk to that go into education, they've known they wanted to be a teacher since they met their kindergarten teacher, and that's all they ever
Hmm.
wanted to do.
Yeah.
I didn't figure that out until I was a junior or senior in college, and by that point, I was already getting my political science degree. Fortunately, with a lot of places, New York State in particular, what you can do is you can take an undergrad degree you have in something else in some other field, and you can get a master's program that will get you certified to teach, get you a master's degree, and get you basically all set to go.
Hmm.
And at least in New York State, you need a master's degree within 5 years of you starting teaching, anyways. So it's one of
Right.
those things where you're going to need to get a master's degree, and this is kind of a good way to get it out of the way before you actually begin your career.
Hmm.
And so the process for me was basically looking around and see which places had that program, trying to figure out, okay, where is it? Because not every place that offers education is going to have a program like this.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and one of the first places I talked to was SUNY Oswego, which is actually
Hmm.
where you and I met.
Right.
And it was, if I'm being completely honest with you, the main reason why I picked it there. Number one, I've got good memories of the time that you and I spent together. But also number two, and I believe they have since gotten rid of this rule. But SUNY Oswego did not require me to take the GRE before going into the master's
Ooh,
program, and so I just had
interesting.
to, yeah, I just had to apply, and it was, it was close to my house, or close enough to
Hmm.
my house, and everything else, where the situation was just able to work. It wasn't a situation where I was looking to see who was working there. It wasn't a situation to see, what the strengths of any given
Hmm.
professor or what the strengths of the program were. It was basically just, will this program get me where I want to go? And that program, it was one of the fastest programs of its kind.
Hmm.
In just over a year, you get certified to teach instead of 2 years, which is the typical time for this kind of thing.
Right.
And I didn't have to take the GRE. It was pretty close to home. It ended up working out pretty well, kind of in all respects for me. And that's kind of how I wound up at SUNY Oswego. And 15 months after I started there, I graduated with my my MST, Master's in Social Studies Education. And that is,
Interesting.
that's how I wound up there. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think you've ever really talked about that with me. Like even, obviously off podcast. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember getting Snapchats from me the
Hmm.
my first summer of grad school, where I was just dying into work because I
I
didn't
do
know
I
what
do
was
remember
going on.
that. Yes.
Yeah, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know how to teach. I didn't know what all these new words meant. And so it was, that was a rough beginning, because it really is a crash course. If this is the kind of thing you're
Yeah.
looking to do, it is, okay, you are going to be immersed in this, and you're not going to know what's going on for the for several months. At one point, I was talking to one of my professors, and I had a question on an assignment or something. And I go to her and I'm like, "Hey, Dr. R, I don't understand." And before I could finish that sentence, she goes, "You're not supposed to understand." And I'm like, "No, like I have a question
Um
on this thing." And she's like, "No, like you're not going to understand anything here for like the first 9 months, and then eventually you'll get it." Um, and as odd as that might sound, she was 100% correct. Eventually, between 9 to 12 months in that program, all of a sudden you kind of start, you've been immersed in it for long enough at that point. You kind of start understanding the terms and everything else. So that's kind of
yeah.
how, yeah, that's how I wound up with my master's degree.
Interesting. Um and so since you talked a little bit about it and it completely skipped my mind because I blocked it out on purpose. But you mentioned a couple times the GRE.
Yes.
And so off the top of my head, I don't actually remember what that stands for. Uh, Obviously, it stands for like graduate something examination, but I'm actually gonna look that up right now.
Graduate record examinations.
Is that what that is?
Yeah, apparently that's what it is. And my
Okay,
understanding was that it was like a SAT for grad school, but I didn't take it. So do you want to help me out with that?
yeah. So that's more or less it. It is an SAT for grad school, and it's actually interesting that you said that you think SUNY Oswego might now require the GRE for that program when they didn't before.
Yeah, I might have like ruined that for everybody else.
Well, the reason I find that really interesting is because generally, the GRE is much less of a factor than it used to be. Um, Similarly to the SAT and
Good.
the ACT and that kind of stuff, because
Right.
I think most places are coming to realize that like the results of one single test probably aren't that accurate in determining how good of a student you are. Just my opinion.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
well, right. It's both that and also the inequities in, in how people do on that test, particularly the SAT,
yeah.
and ACT in high school. But, even still, there are, you are measuring different things than just how smart someone is or how ready they are for a
Hmm.
program in a single test like that. However, many of you are going to have to take it if you wind up
Yes.
wanting to go to grad school. So I can't speak much to this, but Gavin, I assume you took it. Do you want to talk a little bit about just kind of what that test entailed, how you prepared for it, just how hard
Hmm.
was it?
Yeah. So basically, there are, I think, 5 parts, one of which is not graded, but they don't tell you which one it is. One of them is basically for them to test questions on for future exams,
Hmm.
but they don't tell you. So you'll get, um, I think there's one, God, like I said, I kind of blocked it out because I did not enjoy it. And it's like, in general, I consider myself a pretty good test taker. Um, but again, it was just like, you know, even though I had been told that it is less of a factor than it used to be, that, that only helps so much. Uh, but
Right.
yeah, so from what I remember, it was basically two like sort of general knowledge things that you should know if you have a bachelor's degree in general, and then two math, which seems dumb to me because it's like, okay, if you have a degree in English, why do you have two math sections? Um,
And also, like, if you're going to grad school for
Again,
something
I
that's
I
not met,
might,
you think it'd be more specialized.
and there are specialized editions. So there's the general GRE test, and then there are sort of specific GRE tests. And
Hmm.
to my knowledge, the only ones for that are biology, chemistry. There used to be one in geology, but there's not anymore. Literature and English, math, physics, psychology. So I believe those are the only sort of extra add-on type ones. Uh, yeah, there's the GRE general test, which is general, and then subject tests are the name of the more specific ones. Uh, but yeah, I'm trying to find easily somewhere online right now what the parts are, but I remember that there are 5 parts, only 4 of which are graded. Um, it will take generally about 4 hours of your day, which is really annoying because again,
Whew.
not everyone can just sort of voluntarily go and take 4 hours out of a day.
And Wikipedia tells me it costs $205 to take,
It
which,
sure does. And
yeah.
here's what they don't tell you. Um,
Oh,
that does not include sending your scores to schools
of course not. Of course not. Why
because
would it?
you get to send your scores to 4 schools immediately after you walk out. You don't get to see your results. You get to see rough results, like sort of estimated results, but you do not get to see your final scores. And you can send it to 4 schools for free right when you leave. You need to basically, and their system for searching for schools, because you don't just type in, if I wanted to send it to South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, it is more difficult than it should be to just type in South Dakota School of Mines and click send score. But no, you need the school's like code that they use for the GRE, some of which are a little harder to find than others. So I wrote down the 4 schools that I wanted to send it to uh, beforehand on like a sticky note that I had to like leave with my phone and everything in like a locker before I actually went into like the test room. You can't have anything in your pocket, not like your wallet. You can't have like a watch, no phone, keys, whatever. All of it goes in like a little locker thing. Um, and then you walk out, and there's like a little thing for you to like send your scores, and you do that. You get 4 of them for free. After that, literally as soon as you walk out the door, if you want to send your scores to any school, it costs $27 a pop.
I mean, you got to give credit to whoever comes up with these things. They're making a killing
They're
on
very
people that don't
creative
have
in
much
how
money
they
to
screw
spend.
you. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like these people, if you're coming out of undergrad, you don't have a whole lot of money to spend, and yet they're still squeezing every last cent out of you.
Yeah. So,
So, I mean, so we've talked
uh,
about the GRE, and that is kind of your
mm,
entrance exam into grad school. What is so? If we're talking about grad school itself, kind of what is in your field? What's the purpose of going to grad school? Why is an undergrad not good enough, or is an undergrad good enough? In some cases, it just wasn't right for you, or was it right for you, and this whole thing was a giant mistake? Like, what's the how would you kind of evaluate how necessary a grad degree is?
it very much depends on your field. Um, for example, I will speak to paleontology just because obviously that's what I do. Uh, but for paleontology, there are actually a wide variety of things that you can do. Most people sort of think of, oh, it's the people who work at a university that go out into the desert in the summer and dig up dinosaurs. And that is only just the sort of very beginning of what a paleontologist is, you know? Um, for example, we have lots of people who volunteer for us, but at some other places, there are paid workers who do this, but they prepare fossils. So we have like a really nice preparation lab at my school, meaning so like when we bring a fossil back from digging them up in the field, usually during the summer, they still have a bunch of rock and gross stuff around them, but we want to get to like the actual bones so we can look at it and study it and stuff. But we need, people with time on their hands, which frequently professors don't have, uh, to work on that specimen to be able to make it researchable by the professors. In some places, that is a paid position, and you can do that generally with a bachelor's. Uh, or if you happen to like volunteer, if there's a museum with a preparation lab that you volunteer at a lot in high school, sometimes they'll even take you right out of high school if you've been like volunteering with them for a while and know how to do it. So that is a really important job in paleontology that really often gets talked about a lot less than the more charismatic digging up dinosaurs.
You say it's really important. Do they pay you commensurately with how important it is?
No. um, just because in general, so for example, our preparator, our main person who works on that, she has a master's degree, and granted, I do not know how much she gets paid, but I do know that part of her pay comes from grants and stuff. So like only part of her pay comes from the actual school. So I don't know how unique that is personally in the industry. Um, from what I've gathered, it does not seem all that unique. Uh, but in general, you can do a lot of things in paleontology with a just a bachelor's degree. And I don't mean to say like just a bachelor's degree. I know plenty of people with bachelor's degrees that probably make more money than I will. Um,
Right, but it's not necessarily required to get many different jobs in that field. It's required for some, but
right.
it is, there are other ways to go about getting into, having a career in this field.
Yeah. So for me personally, up until probably about a year ago, very shortly after lockdown started last spring, I began to realize that my entire life I had known I'm like, okay, I want to be a I want to do research as a profession. I want to get a PhD. I want to be a fake doctor, not a medical doctor. Uh, and I want to be at a university and I want to teach and do research. After seeing how little scientific literacy there is in the world, and COVID really making that painfully obvious, and also coming to realize how many people there are in paleontology doing that, going the PhD route. So there's way more people getting PhDs than PhD jobs open up per year.
Of course.
Right. Um, so I was like, I personally think that like I would be happy doing that. I enjoy doing research. I enjoy the teaching that I've done so far. Um, but I think that my personal time would be better spent in like an informal education type setting. Um, so mostly, given that I'm about to graduate, like anyone who's about to graduate, I've been applying to lots of jobs, and so a lot of them have been stuff like working at museums. Uh, Generally, depending on what you're exactly doing with the museum, that can require anything from a bachelor's all the way up to a PhD. If you're doing things like curating the collections, basically doing research and you know maybe not so much organizing, but doing research on things in the collections. Generally, that requires a PhD. But for most of the jobs that I've been applying to, like a collections manager, which is the person who sort of controls fossils coming in, fossils going out, like on loan or something, um, the organization of the collections facility, and also all the like regulations and things that go along with keeping fossils, because there are many laws that you have to be knowledgeable about and follow. Um, Generally, that requires a master's at most places. Um, and then also I've been applying to like community college teaching jobs, just because while, like I said, I would enjoy doing research, I also just really enjoy talking and nerding out about science to people.
Hence this
Hence,
podcast.
hence this podcast. Uh, and I feel like I'd have more of a personal impact on people in a smaller college setting like that. So that's the jobs that I've been applying for with a master's.
Yeah, and so the kind of the field you wanted to go into, you kind of needed to get a master's degree in order to go into the kind of work you're doing.
Right.
Is there, now is there any thought in your mind about continuing that education, going for maybe a doctorate or, some other degree, or are you done?
Maybe eventually. It
What purpose
really,
would that serve if you were to get your doctorate?
me right now, I think it would be more for myself than for my job, personally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, for example, the teacher that I am ATA for right now, he worked at the United States Geological Survey for a very long time, uh, and then came to teach, at my school a handful of years ago. And so, even though he is, I'm trying to think if he's at least in his late 50s, but he's getting a PhD right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think
He's
he
doing that for
said,
him.
well, he says that like right now his title is lecturer, um, and in order to become a like senior lecturer, he needs a PhD. So he's sort of doing it for like the job title, but also, even once he becomes senior lecturer, by that point he'll be in his early 60s. How much longer is he actually going to be teaching? You
Right.
know, so I
Mm-hmm.
think I do think he's mostly doing that for him. And so
Right.
I
And
could see
like,
myself doing that and going that route. But as
mhm.
for, you know, me doing it for a job, I that's just 4 to 6 years of my life that I don't want to spend doing that.
Right. To then wind up probably still being just criminally underpaid with whatever
Exactly.
you wind up doing. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so let's see. So we talked about the beginning of grad school. We talked a little bit about sort of the after of grad school. So
Mm-hmm.
the during of grad school. So we'll talk about
Mm-hmm.
the immediate prior to grad school, and then we'll get into sort of what happens during grad school. So for me, um, how I decided to go here instead of the other two places that I had gotten into, uh, it was a combination of a couple things. So given that I'm from the Northeast, there are not too many schools around there that have really good vertebrate paleontology. People studying that, just because there are not many vertebrate fossils in the Northeast. It's all generally older, stuff. So it's like any vertebrate fossils that are there are usually just like fish, which I don't personally find all that interesting. So I sort of, and that's why all of my places that I applied to were kind of all over the place. California, Kansas, South Dakota, Michigan. Um, so yeah, that's sort of why I applied to those places, because they had people doing what I wanted to do. Why I accepted or ended up going to South Dakota School of Mines was a combination of location and money. because unlike many other master's or graduate school programs, uh, most sciences, at least core sciences, so that would be your geology, biology, chemistry, and physics, generally have guaranteed money for going to that program. Whereas for you, I would assume that you did not get paid to be in grad school.
That would be correct.
Right. And I have some friends, I have several friends who are actually doing like speech language pathology, and they're working on a master's for that right now. They're definitely not getting paid.
Right.
So to my knowledge, it's pretty much only like the core sciences, maybe some social sciences as well. But I feel like that would be much more rare than getting paid in the core sciences. And the reason that is because we generally do one of two things once you are in grad school. You are a teacher's assistant or a TA, or you are a research assistant or an RA. And so either you're teaching a lab, or in the case of some PhD programs, you're teaching an entire class while you're taking classes and doing your research yourself. Or you are a research assistant, doing research and getting paid for that. So those are sort of the two options. And, out of the three places that I got into, Fresno would have been probably my ideal location. However, the only thing that they offered me for money was turning my out-of-state tuition into in-state tuition. And
So they gave you a
so,
discount code. They didn't actually give you any money.
right. And so the person that I had been talking to, that would have been my advisor, said that they had some teaching assistant opportunities, but that it wasn't guaranteed. And so I'm like, you can't expect me to move from New York to Fresno, California, a place that is generally very expensive to live in, without a guaranteed paycheck. Like I'm just not going to do that.
And nor should you. I mean, that's,
Yeah.
that is putting yourself at unnecessary risk
Hmm.
for, benefits that you could get anywhere else.
Right.
I shouldn't say anywhere else, but, other places.
Hmm. And then sort of on the opposite spectrum of that was the school in Kansas, Fort Hays State University, which offered me the most money in that they give me a full tuition waiver. And also, I think, pretty generous stipend as well. However, it was in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. And to be fair, they have really cool things on campus. They have a great museum on campus. The person who actually is the collections manager there, she's excellent on Twitter. Her name is Ali Baumgartner, I think. But anyway, you can follow the museum at, I think, FSHU Museum on Twitter. Weird plug. I follow them on Twitter. They're great. But yeah, so excellent resources there. But like the town itself, it was around 20-ish thousand people in rural Kansas. So like for rural Kansas, a decent sized city, but rural Kansas, not necessarily my scene, personally.
Yeah, there's not too many people in rural Kansas. Not many people seen.
Mm-hmm. So sort of the middle option between the two was South Dakota School of Mines and Technology in Rapid City. Rapid City has a lot of cool things around it. The Black Hills, we've talked about them. They're really cool geologically and just nature-wise as well. Lots of things around to do. It's a decent-sized city, around 65 to 70-ish thousand people. So the biggest city I have ever personally lived in, as well as the money was not amazing, but enough to live. So that's sort of why I chose here, personally. I would have been happy working with any of those three, advisors that I had been accepted by. But I happened to choose here, and as we've talked about before, my advisor turned out to be just an excellent human being. I love him. And so that's why I ended up here as opposed to those other places. And you
And so
you've yeah, go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say we've talked, both of us how we wound up at
Mhm.
our respective schools in different ways. So now, and we talked about what happens afterwards. So let's get into, whatever time we have left, what actually happens while you were in grad school, outside of the specifics of classes
Mhm.
or anything. what did grad school actually entail for you?
Yeah, so and this can also, as I'm sure you probably have guessed or you can probably assume, this varies wildly from school to school. So for me, um, there were three required classes, and the rest I could sort of fill in. As well as I think 12 credits of thesis, maybe 9 credits of thesis, um, which is basically just like dedicated time for you to be doing your research. Uh, and then so yeah, 3 required classes, I think 9 credits of thesis, and then I think you just needed like 30 credits total or something to that effect. Uh, but yeah, so the required classes were one called paleobiology, which is fairly straightforward. It's basically just studying extinct animals as if they were living animals, so just going through diversity and basically a biology class, but with a paleontology focus. Field paleontology, which we've talked about before, and then my school is just called Geology 700, which is basically just introduction to grad school. It's basically like, here's the library, here's how to use our system that our library uses. Here, basically like introduction to grad school / introduction to campus, for folks who didn't do their bachelor's at that same school. And those were the only three that were required. However, because our department is relatively small, uh, it is pretty straightforward which classes you take. You don't have many options. Not to say that our classes that we have aren't awesome, because every class that I've taken here, with perhaps one exception, have been incredible. They've been really, really good and very useful and interesting for me to learn about. However, with classes, it's like you probably want there to be some kind of a choice in the classes that you take. Um, and I'm sure at a bigger school like the University of Michigan, there probably would be more options. Um, but that's just sort of the nature of going to a smaller school like I go to. Um,
Right.
so that's definitely something to keep in mind when you're sort of considering where to apply, and then where to accept. But basically, you need 9 credits to be full time, and you need to be full time in order to be a TA or an RA. So 9 credits realistically isn't a lot. That can be basically 2 classes a semester plus your thesis credits. Um, and then basically, very rough timeline in that Geology 700, that Intro to Grad School class. That is where you sort of plan what you're going to be doing for your thesis. It basically is a class that makes you not procrastinate doing your thesis proposal. So you develop that throughout your first semester in graduate school, and then you sort of refine the proposal itself in your second semester with your advisor. You present your thesis proposal, basically being like, hey, here's what I'm planning to do, here's how I'm planning to do it, please let me do science. And essentially you present that and defend it in front of your committee. And they basically, similar to like a thesis defense, they say, okay, well, here's some changes that you need to make, here's some things that you need to think more about, and go nuts. So in a normal grad school system of 2 years, you would do some of your research over the summer between your 2 years. If you need to travel or anything, that's when you would do it. Unfortunately, that was not a thing thanks to COVID. So
Yeah.
thanks. And then you do your data collection, over the summer. You run your experiments, or describe your specimens. In my case, over the summer and the fall semester of your second year, and then over sort of like the Christmas-ish break, and then into the very beginning part of spring semester, you are writing your actual thesis. And
Which is what you just finished up, correct?
exactly. And then shortly after midterms, or around, I think the deadline to defend your thesis at my school is actually this coming Friday. So you have like 2 weeks before the end of the semester to actually defend your thesis in front of your committee, and then they give you some edits and stuff to fix up what you did. or things that you should go back and maybe redo, or think about a little more, resubmit it to your committee, then they submit it to like the graduate office, and bing bang boom, you're pretty much done. That's very fast and dirty how the research for masters works, at least in a thesis track. There are many, I'd say probably the majority of, maybe not at my school, because my school is a, technology and science school, but I'd say the majority of master's programs are not thesis option, like presumably yours was.
Yeah, so when I was in grad school, basically there was sort of, if off the top of my head I might think of more, but kind of three different things that needed to be done. Number one, you needed to, take courses. And for me specifically, again, having not been in education up until the time I got to grad school, it was really an opportunity to just learn what teaching is. We've
Hmm.
all interacted with teachers, and it's really easy to see kind of what goes on the surface. And we've all had good and bad teachers, and we can think we might know what's going on, and to a certain extent, that's definitely helpful. But you take classes to learn about kind of all the behind the scenes stuff and all the different acronyms that get used,
Yeah.
and and kind of all that. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot that they don't teach you in grad school about that, but it is definitely useful to have those courses that are there to you know to try and get you up to speed just with some of the technical language of the of the profession, which then leads you into number two. This isn't quite a thesis, but there is, at least in New York State and a number of states around the country, use this test. But there's sort of a it's not a sit down kind of test, but it's more of a portfolio kind of thing, is the best way
Hmm.
I can describe it.
Okay.
It's called the EdTPA, where you
Right.
need to basically, it's in three parts. Part one is you need to basically like plan a lesson and say, here's what I plan on doing. Part two involves you actually recording that lesson and in front of students, like teaching it live. And then part three is kind of reflecting on that lesson, is sort of the best, at least as my recollection goes. It is an absolute bear. It is not a whole lot of fun. It kind of, once again, falling into similar to the GRE, I don't think it's a great measure of whether or not people will be good teachers, but
Hmm.
it is something that you basically need to pass in order to become a teacher, at least again in New York State. And so you really need to make sure, those, you're going to feel definitely out of place in your first regular classes just because you don't know what's going on. At least, especially if you're doing what I did, again, coming from a non education background. But all of those classes and learning all that, as well as your professors that know you're in that boat and kind of know what's going on, um, you know, all of that will help you prepare your EdTPA, which you'll then go about recording and actually you know putting into practice while you are student teaching, which is the third one. And this is kind of the the sexiest one, if you want to call it that, because it's where you actually get to go and put everything into practice, and you get to say,
Right.
okay, I've learned X, Y, and Z. Can I get up in front of a group of students, and even though I'm going to make 1,000 mistakes, and even though I might not exactly know what it is that's going on, can I get up in front of a group of students and actually teach?
Hmm.
And that is where, when most people talk about their grad school from their, from an education point of view, that's what most people are going to remember is, how their student teaching went, what kind of cooperating teacher they had. So you are taking over somebody else's classroom, and you basically have to, live under the rules of whatever teacher's, class that actually is. How do they want grades done? Do they want to see your lesson plans ahead of time? Are they just going to, like take off into the teacher's room for 2 months and just you're on your own? There's any number of ways that can go, but it's also definitely the most rewarding, and it tells you kind of the most about your future. If that doesn't go well, it's not to say that things are dead for you, because people can obviously improve. But if there are certain aspects of teaching that you just aren't going to get in a classroom, and you can only really work on, or pardon me, you're not going to get, when I say in a classroom, I mean learning about it. There are certain things you're only able to do teaching in front of actual students. And so kind of, while I was in grad school in my program, those were the three big things: was taking classes just to get myself up to speed on what is a teacher and what do I really need to know in order to go into this field, getting my ed TPA ready, and making sure, because that is that really is a bear and it's not fun. And then actually student teaching and making sure that, I can walk into a classroom and I can teach things to students as well as, interact with them on a more human level. Those were really the three big parts to my grad school program that, I had to go through. And then, of course, there's always the, hanging out with your friends that are going through the same thing, that are in the
Mm-hmm.
same boat as you,
Yep.
which is, an important part of just being able to make it through grad school.
Absolutely. And if my office mates haven't been, or weren't pretty cool people, my masters would have been significantly harder.
Yeah, absolutely.
um, but yeah, and then to just sort of give like a third sort of example, and this is only very, loose, just what I've been told by some of those friends who are doing speech language pathology. Basically, they are doing like just classes, and from what I can tell, taking significantly more classes than me. Because like, how many classes did you take a semester? And like, where you going? You were going like full time, right?
Yeah, so it was, oh goodness. I feel like it was three three in-person classes plus one or two online classes at a time when I was just taking classes, and then
Mm-hmm.
student teaching was its own thing. So I
Right.
had one semester that was just straight up, I was student teaching in two different places um, for one semester. Part of, actually, I forgot about this. So before you student teach, you've got to go do what are called practicum hours, which is
Mm-hmm.
basically just you show up to a class and you're supposed to just observe and see what's going on. You're not actually teaching or planning lessons. Most of the time you can wind up saying, hey, I'll teach this lesson. Let's see if this works. And assuming you and that teacher have a good relationship, oftentimes you'll wind up student teaching there. But yeah, it was kind of like three classes in person for me, doing observations and taking one online class, which is what I had for that. And then, student teaching was its own thing.
Gotcha. But yeah, so they, from what I could tell, in this is just what I've been told about this like one specific program. So again, I'm sure this could vary, but they take like in speech language pathology in your first year, you take like at least as many credits in classes as you did in undergrad, if not more. And then your second year, you do like clinical stuff. So you basically do speech language pathology with a supervisor. So it's like you can't do it like unsupervised, essentially, basically
Jeez.
similar to like student teaching almost. But they see like actual clients and things like that, and
Hmm.
uh, which is probably why they really front load the schedule with a lot of classes your first year. So that's what that seems like to me. And to my knowledge, they also don't get paid for doing that clinical stuff.
This is for speech language pathology.
Yes, and the reason why
Yeah, no.
I talk about that one specifically is because I have several friends that I went to undergrad with, who are doing that. And actually, I also have a friend who is in grad school right now for chiropractic,
Really?
and she is at a school that is much more science based than a lot of other chiropractic schools. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, so she is also taking many classes. Her school is weird in that they have quarters instead of semesters, um, and I think like 2 weeks between each quarter or something like that. So very very packed schedule, but taking many classes and clinical stuff throughout the year or the 2 years that she's there. Um, but yeah, so depending on what you do, grad school it can vary so wildly. And
Oh,
I'm
of course.
very lucky that I'm in a position where I get paid. So, uh, one of the benefits, if you're listening to this podcast, presumably you are interested in some form in science. So if you end up
If
going to
you've made it
grad
this far.
school, yeah, if you're interested in going to grad school for science, you picked the right field, in my opinion. Um, yeah. So, and also a bonus is that for me, so you've said that even though you didn't go for education, in order to teach high school and middle school, you need to go get a master's in education.
Yes, at some point you will need to get a if you're going to be teaching, at least in a public school
Right.
in New York State, you are going to need to get a master's degree. And I believe that's the case in many other states across the country.
Yeah, I believe so too. But for me to be able to teach college, I do not.
Oh,
I can
really?
I can just go. I could get hired tomorrow to go teach. You know, because I have a master's, they'd probably let me do sort of like entry level classes.
I was
Um,
gonna say, like, how likely is it that you would actually, get hired to teach at that point?
you'd be surprised.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I had, let's see, at my community college that I went to, um, he wasn't my teacher because I was like a science major, but he taught several like biology classes, mostly for like non biology majors, mostly to get like their science, elective or whatever out of the way. So many people who teach like the non science majors version of a science class generally, you know, I shouldn't say generally, but much more frequently you will find them that they only have masters instead of PhDs.
Huh,
Also,
that is surprising. I would not have
mhm,
guessed that.
even at my 4 year school, in my final semester, so this was, I was getting a bachelor's degree and finishing a bachelor's degree. My genetics lab teacher, I, off the top of my head, I don't even know if he had a master's. I
That's
would
just
assume that
nuts.
he, I would assume that he did. He did have lots of like industry experience. He worked at um, like biopharmaceutical company for several years. So like he had previous, like lab experimental experience. So that obviously probably bolstered his resume when he applied a fair bit. Uh, but yeah, so he definitely didn't have a PhD. May not have had a master's, although I would assume that he did. Um,
I mean, good for, good for whoever hired him, not just saying that, grad school had to be the be all end all, or getting a
mhm.
doctorate was the be all end all, because like, you know, I don't want to say it's worth nothing, but there's especially, in the sciences, I would assume, like there's a lot more out there than to, just having that piece of paper.
Yeah, exactly. And a really, just really quickly, a piece of, or like a subsection of paleontology that I had sort of known existed but didn't ever think about until a class I'm taking this semester. Um,
Hmm.
so basically, anytime that something is built on federal lands, they need to do sort of like a survey uh, to see if there is stuff there that might not want to be destroyed by construction. Typically,
Hmm.
in the Northeast, it's mostly things. Well, there's not really much federal land in the Northeast, but when
Hmm.
they do stuff on what limited federal land there is, they typically are looking for archaeological things, human associated things. But out in the West, if you're doing things on, the Bureau of Land Management land, then you probably need a paleontological monitor there. Somebody that's just sort of checking all of, you have a big excavator, dig out a hole. The paleontologist comes in, looks at it. Is there fossils there? If no, cool. You can keep going. If not, they sort of stop stuff for like an hour. Maybe the construction crew or whoever will go take lunch. They'll figure out, okay, is this something major? Is this something that we need to take out? Is this, they'll report it no matter what it is, pretty much. But whether it's, something worth stopping the entire construction for a couple days to work on, they sort of determine that. And while the person overseeing all of that stuff generally does have a PhD, a lot of like the actual workers and monitors might only have like a bachelor's.
I mean, it's definitely it's surprising, but also kind of heartening to hear that it's just not. It is less of a requirement than you would think, and I don't know if there's going to be a moral to this podcast or not, but just you know, there it's not like a linear path to get where you're going.
Absolutely.
In some cases, it is if you want to teach in public schools in New York State, you need a master's degree at some point.
Hmm.
But with lots of different jobs, and this being a primarily science podcast, you can kind of take a bunch of different paths to get where you want to go. As long as you know what you're doing or what you think you want to do,
Hmm.
there's probably a way to make that happen in 8 out of 10 cases.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely true. Like that's a really, and I also think that's pretty fair. 8 out of 10. Obviously, if you want to teach, you know, full time and do research at even like a relatively small, even like a relatively small state school, you'll probably need a PhD. That's just the way it is. But if you want to teach at a relatively small college, you might only need a master's. So, um, yeah. So that's sort of grad school in a nutshell. A kind of rambly grad school in a nutshell.
Yeah, that is, I think this was a fun episode just for both of us to kind of learn a little bit more about, how the other one got to where they were. And hopefully it was useful to anybody out there that's thinking about going to grad school.
Mhm.
So this has been the congratulations, Gavin. You have a master's degree, or you will have one soon, I
And
guess.
yeah, with an asterisk there.
Yeah. Well, I'll put that in there. Gavin, you have a master's degree episode of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. Gavin, congratulations, buddy, and I'll talk to you next week.
Absolutely. See you then.